Dinner, a podcast of cooking, curiosity, and conversation. If you love cooking, hate cooking, have no idea how you even feel about cooking because you've never tried it before, congratulations, you are in the right place. I am DC Pierson. I am a comedian, author, enthusiastic home cook, and for the past 3 out of 4 episodes, I have been doing a ramen project on the show where I have been making different elements all to go into a final bowl of ramen. And at this point, the actual final bowl of ramen is a couple of weeks in our past. Haley made handmade noodles to go in the bowl. I made chashu on the show. I made shiotare on the show. That's the flavoring agent that goes into the broth that I also made on the show, which was tonkatsu broth. And I have to say, it was fantastic. I really, really felt a sense of accomplishment getting to put all of these elements together and being like, this is a really, really good, super satisfying bowl of ramen, perfect for this time of year. And I was thrilled about it. It didn't super make sense to do a whole thing just about assembling the bowl, and it's part of the vagaries of doing a show where sometimes you're actually making stuff to feed your family that it didn't really make sense to record and make a whole episode out of. But nevertheless, I wanted to do something to kind of commemorate the finale of the ramen project. And so what I decided to do is welcome to the show my guests today, Sarah Becan and Hugh Amano, the authors of the tome, the comic book cookbook, Let's Make Ramen, that I based my entire journey on, the recipes contained therein. And I loved talking to Sarah and Hugh. It was really fun. It was a super, super interesting conversation. At least I found it to be so. I think you'll find it to be the same, about depicting food in art. Why do we find food to be or look delicious? How does depicting recipes in comic book form, how is that different than in printed form, like in a normal cookbook? Why is Chicago a great ramen city? Where did ramen even come from? We ran the gamut in this conversation. I had an awesome time. I had as awesome of a time as I had making this bowl of ramen and going on this journey. I hope that you will enjoy it as well. I think you will. And we also talked about their new project coming out in 2021. Let's Make Dumplings. I am so excited for that. If there's one, I say it in the interview, but if there's one food that I am as passionate or more passionate about than ramen, it would be dumplings. So I cannot wait for that. Look forward to my inevitable dumpling project in 2021 when that book comes out. And that's it. Enjoy this conversation with Sarah Becan and Hugh Amano. I gotta hit start on the record because this is food content that we cannot afford to let slip through our fingers. So you were saying Hugh is running to grab something, but Sarah, you were saying that you have an overabundance of winter squash and sweet potatoes because you're signed up for a CSA and you're in the upper Midwest, and that's literally all that's growing right now.
Right. For most of the summer, it was fantastic. Like, we got Chinese and Japanese eggplants, we got kale and chard, we got like special Italian onions and, huge amounts of tomatoes. But by the end of the season, I picked it up one week and it was 20 acorn squash. And I love winter squash. I really do. But I am running out of ideas of what to do with them. And, and the very last pickup was a half bushel of sweet potatoes and nothing more.
So how much is a bushel? Is that like a sack? Like when you see a sack, a true potato sack, is that a bushel? Is that more than a bushel? How much is a bushel? Give me a visual reference.
I had to look it up because when they were like, we're giving you a half bushel of sweet potatoes, like I don't have a car. So I was going to pick this up on my bike, right? And I was like, do I have the capability to pick up like 20, like how much is a half bushel? And the amount is different for almost all different kinds of produce.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of strange. But so for potatoes and sweet potatoes, I think a bushel is 50 pounds.
Oh my God. So you have 25 pounds of sweet potatoes.
25 pounds of sweet potatoes. And then I had to decide if I was going to go on foot with like multiple, tote bags trying to carry 25 pounds of sweet potatoes, or if I was going to manage to fit 25 pounds of sweet potatoes in the panniers of my bicycle.
And what did you end up doing?
I went with the bike. It worked out okay. I went to the panniers, so I was balanced.
Oh my gosh. Oh, no worries. We were I started the record because I realized that this was precious food content that we could not afford to go unpodcasted.
Bushel numbers, and that is like a question everybody has, and there's no answer.
It seems to be different for everything.
It's always different. And I don't even know that like what you get in the CSA is actually a book. Like it's just the box, it's just that standard produce box.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, that would make sense because like that was the size box that we got for most of the summer. It was just usually a variety of different things. And then the last pickup, the entire box was nothing but sweet potatoes.
yeah.
And there's no ability to like pickle a root vegetable, right? That's not a thing. Is there?
You can preserve actually in Japan, like I don't know exactly how they do it, but I have come across sort of preserved sweet potatoes and yams and whatnot. But it's not like I honestly don't know exactly how they do that. You could always just like figure out how to ferment them and make soju and just get it all winter.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a lot of stuff. So I actually have a recipe. I'll send you like one way to use sweet potatoes. So,
I'll take it. Okay. I want to hear, like, what is it?
Well, I'm trying to think. So DC, like, just to catch you up, I wrote a book for the company that I work for as well, because I'm a private chef during the day. And I wrote that's going to be the holiday gift this year, and so it's a big cookbook. It's great and all pro produced and all that, but I'm like trying to think in there, what do I use sweet potatoes in? And there's two. One is just a sweet potato hash, and then the other is just the full blast loaded like baked sweet potato, which is a great way to do it as well.
Yeah.
And actually, I'll just send it to both of you on this chain that we have.
Please do. My wife and I have become a big fan of the I guess it's a Japanese thing, but like just roasting a sweet potato in tinfoil in the oven for like a million years. It's the best.
Absolutely. Nice. It really gets like it develops in flavor so much. And when it, how it gets almost like there's parts that get kind of syrupy. It's just, man, it is great.
It's so good. And then she does it with like tahini and lemon and salt. And it's just like, that's lunch. It's the best.
That sounds fantastic.
Well, Sarah, you can have that. If that sounds good to you, you can probably have that up to 30 times with stuff you already have in your house.
We've been making all sorts of jokes about how like we are set on beta carotene for this winter.
Totally.
You're going to be like one of those things where it's like there was that town in Appalachia where everyone just like turned purple for some reason. Like that's going to be, you guys are going to emerge from the pandemic just like with a slightly orange tinge, but it's not like a jaundice thing. People are like, somehow they look healthier. I don't get it. Well, Sarah, Hugh, thank you so much for joining me. I have, as I'm sure you're aware, oh wow, I just realized that I am using the wrong setting on my mic. Hold on one second. I'm just going to switch over. Great. Now it will sound not like I'm in a wind tunnel. Fantastic. It should sound the same for you guys, but just for my own recording. But I, as you two are no doubt all too aware, I am a huge fan of your book, Let's Make Ramen. I can't remember how I became aware of it. I think just somebody retweeted it on Twitter, and it was a true, like, if my life were an Edgar Wright movie, it would have been one of those things where it would have been like, I see that, like, fast push in on that, fast push in on me, and then just like a really quick like close up of me hitting like bye now. I was
That's awesome.
so stoked on it,
That's great.
and it completely lived up to how excited I was for it. I really love it. I've been on a kind of a like ramen kick for a little while, and that would be like something that I would tell people. I remember I was working, I will write for like a lot of like award shows and stuff, and sometimes that would involve travel back when that was, you know, like a thing. And I remember I was working on a show one year in New York, and I was like, I told the other writers I was working with, I was like, yeah, I've been on kind of a ramen kick. I'm like going out for ramen every night because I don't have anything else to do. And the guy I was working with, who I'd worked with the previous year as well, he was like, you've been on a little bit of a ramen kick for at least a year, because you said the exact same thing last year when we worked on this show. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that's true. But this book was kind of, it was thrilling to sort of like know that you could bridge the gap from being somebody that just really likes seeking out and eating ramen to somebody who could make it at home and gain a deeper appreciation for it that way. So thank you for that. It's been really cool. What inspired you guys to start working on this book? What forged your collaboration? How did this book come about?
It's a Sarah question. I'll let your yeah, this is Sarah.
Gosh, I mean, I feel like this is so long ago at this point. I mean, well, we both love ramen. Like, we're both very much into ramen. And I had been doing some commercial illustration for a couple of Asian-focused restaurants in my neighborhood in Chicago. And one of them was Fat Rice, which Hugh worked at for a short time. And when they made a book of all of their recipes, they asked me to illustrate it. So Hugh and I worked together on this book for a little while. And then the same publisher came back through the agent who had brokered that deal and asked if I'd be interested in doing a comic book cookbook of ramen recipes. Because a lot of the recipes for the Fat Rice cookbook we had done in comic book format. And I'd been drawing comic book recipes for a web comic that I was doing called I Think You're Sawsome. So I was very much into the idea of using comics as a way to, you know, to show the instructions of how to cook something. And I guess it worked well enough for the publisher on The Adventures of Fat Rice that they decided they wanted to try to do a ramen book with it. And I was all for it. And it just seemed natural to team up with Hugh on something like that.
How have you, what has that experience been like for you? Like doing recipes in this non-traditional format and doing cookbooks in this sort of non-traditional format. How have people reacted to it? And what do you feel like the trade-offs are? Because I mean, you know, obviously we think of, you know, a usual cookbook as having like, you know, a head note, or like the part that people have really taken to like complaining about in online recipes now, like people on social media being like, why is there a 2-page essay before the recipe? Just give me the ingredients, man. Where I just want to be like, you can scroll down, right? Like you can scroll, you can do it. Also, I feel like that, like, do you want any information about the thing at all, or any sort of like context, or do you just like experience food entirely through like, it says it has 3 lemons in it, it must be good? Like, don't you want somebody to like sell you on it a little bit? I don't know. I have my, that's a complete other tangent, but you know, so we have the part where it's sort of like the cookbook author saying like, here's why I like this thing, or here's why you should make this, and kind of what you need to know about it. And then the actual recipe itself, and then usually a kind of like intimidatingly beautifully food food sculpt, like sort of, or food styled rather,
Right.
image
Wonderful.
that
Yeah.
oftentimes it'll be like, wait a minute, this has like 3 elements that they didn't actually put in the recipe. So I'm a little bit like, why doesn't mine have like chervil
Right.
or whatever?
No,
That's like the, what's that?
well, I notice that all the time too, and like I'm kind of like that, like sort of OCD about stuff like that. So I'll see, like, come on, guy, like you cut this differently than you're telling people to cut it. There's a completely different ingredient that and I think that's so untrue to the person. So sorry, I'm kind of jumping in here, but um, for me, like when we wrote The Adventures of Fat Rice, that's such a it's like an encyclopedia of Macanese cooking, and it's so like in depth and so historical. Um, and I mean, it's a beautiful book, but the recipes are very challenging in there. However, in that experience, it was so important to us to make it correct and to show exactly what you would be making, as far as like all the ingredients and technique and everything being in there. We got kind of weird with some of the presentations and the photos, but anyway, then for me as a writer and as a chef, and like so much of my interest in cooking is the cultural aspect and really just the humanity behind it. We I want to talk so much, like I want to say so much about each dish, and we were able to do that in the Fat Rice book. But with this, obviously, it's a way different format, and Sarah will attest to this. Like I can get kind of wordy, and so for us, a lot of it was really like um, shaving my stuff down to fit and to be appropriate in this format, and without really without dumbing it down, because I think like I'm not a comic book person at all, um, but I really learned in this process that boy, you can get a lot across with images that you just can't with words. And Sarah and I, by now, like we've gotten to understand each other, and how we work together, and that's been huge for us.
Yeah, totally. Like I think I mean there's obviously going to be strengths and weaknesses to either format, like a regular prose recipe or a comic book style recipe. But one of the things like with comics is that you want to lean a lot more towards show don't tell, and you don't want your panels to be overloaded with words because then it's hard to see the action and it kind of takes you out of the strength of like the visual instructions. So yeah, I mean, especially at the beginning, it was kind of, there was a lot of push and pull about like, which of these words are necessary? What can we cut? What can we sort of replace with, imagery and like visual directions? But I think like we ended up with a really nice balance because Hugh is such a fantastic writer too, that, you don't want to cut too much of that either. Like the writing is also incredibly important. And especially with something like ramen, I mean, I know that, we maybe didn't go as in depth with the historical and cultural context that like the Adventures of Fat Rice did, but it's still like there's so much of like that context that's incredibly important to each dish and to each component of the dish, and you don't want to leave that out either. Like you can't just take ramen out of the history of ramen and the culture that it sprang out of.
And how do you, I mean, I guess speaking from my own experience, there is something I love how much you guys still manage to put in there, or I felt like I walked away not just with a sense of, oh, this is like how how the like the flavor and like look of tonkatsu gets so rich and like flavor infused that I literally thought when I first started eating it, like there must be dairy in here. Like I literally thought like there's no way there isn't some sort of dairy product in here because it's so sort of like smooth and it has that kind of like milky look and flavor to it. And it's just so rich that they must just like finish with some heavy cream or something. And then walking away from your book, it's like, I know why it is the way it is now. And I've cooked it. I've like made it. I've experienced it in all of its forms, but not only that, but also understanding sort of like, yeah, this is like how things are, how in these ramen shops, like things are made and eaten and consumed and the entire culture around that and why it is and where it came from. Like, I think you guys did a really great job of infusing all of that in there and also still having like a ton of information and a ton of recipes. Like, I swear there's like more content in this like comic book style book than there is in like giant, super heavy $45 cookbooks that I have, you know, like it is pretty impressive. And another thing I'll say for it that I appreciated is there can almost be something intimidating about those beautifully food styled images as beautiful and attractive and enticing and aspirational as they are. There's something about the kind of like de-literalization of drawing food rather than showing it that really appeals to me. I don't know. I think also, Sarah, maybe it just speaks to like your particular art style and clear appreciation about what's great and great looking about food. But there is something nice about just like taking it from being like, here's a literal representation of food that secretly is actually like crazy styled and like you could never make something that looks like this and still have it be edible because it's covered in like an inedibilizing substance that makes it like super glistening or whatever.
Right.
But there is, you know, it's nice to just take it one step away from that and be like, this is the platonic ideal of a delicious bowl of ramen or a shrimp or a dumpling or whatever.
No, and that's exactly it. Like, I mean, if you let me, will sort of, you know, wax philosophical about Scott McCloud and understanding comics and how the comic form can, by reducing ancillary details that you don't necessarily need, like you get rid of visual details that aren't as important, you can distill the meaning of something into like a much more efficient visual message. I mean, I know this is getting a little cerebral, but like, in that way, like it makes it sort of easier for people to look at and easier for people to digest, like, you know, no pun intended, you know, everything that's in that image than if you had, you know, a photograph where you had all sorts of like everything in the background that isn't necessarily important to the recipe or isn't necessarily important to the dish that you're making.
Yeah, that's so interesting. There is something about that where you just go like, oh yeah, R. Crumb's drawing of R. Crumb looks more like R. Crumb than he himself does. You know what I mean? It's just sort of like that, just true like cartooning, like in the best sense, like just like taking things. Go ahead.
In order to amplify the message.
Yeah, totally. I love that. I think that's so neat, and I think also too it, you know, I'm sure you guys would be the first to acknowledge this, like. Ramen can be kind of like complicated. There's a bunch of different elements. Like there's when you have a bowl of it, and that was something I realized reading this book and it helped me appreciate when you go to a ramen shop and you get a bowl of ramen and there's a ton of little like toppings and stuff and things on it and ingredients, a ton of work went into each of those things that just kind of feel like, oh, and then a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of this. And you really sort of gain an appreciation of that. But also it means like, if you want to make all that stuff, you got to like you either have to like get all that stuff or you have to do all that stuff. And there's something about having all of that laid out rather than in sort of, you know, a giant cookbook where it's going like, by the way, here's this side recipe that you have to like, I feel like a lot of restaurant cookbooks are like this, where it's just like, oh yeah, everything we make at the restaurant, it has this like ginger garlic paste in it. And it's easy for us because we make a giant 10-gallon drum of it at the beginning of every week. But for you at home, it's kind of like, you got to make like 3 of these giant things that we normally make in like these huge batches. And then you have to start making the stuff that's in this book. But I think the nice thing about everything being represented in like comic form is it just kind of was like, and then you can make this and it's fun and it's whatever. And it was cool. I liked it. Sorry for this to turn into the like Chris Farley show of your book of just being like, and then that was cool. And then that was cool. But
That's awesome.
That's how I feel. So Sarah, how did you get into like drawing food specifically and like food inspired comics? Was there like a light bulb moment where you realized like, this is a Venn diagram that I really like existing in?
I don't know if there was, a single sort of epiphany kind of moment. I think it was a gradual realization. Like, I'd been into comics ever since I was a little kid. I had a little 4-panel comic strip published in Cricket magazine when I was 9 years old. My grandfather had a stack of Walt Kelly Pogo books, and my other grandfather had a stack of like Doctor Strange comic books. So I was always into comics, and I'd been making like little indie mini comics that I sold at just like comic book conventions, or took around to the local comic book stores here in Chicago. And I had started this webcomic called I Think You're Sawsome, that when I started it, it was autobiographical, and it was mostly focused on like weight and body image issues. But as part of it, I was doing a food diary, like an illustrated food diary with every day's entry. And as the comic progressed, it became like just naturally a lot more focused on food, because my partner and I, like, we live in a neighborhood that has a lot of really great restaurants in Chicago. So like anytime a new restaurant would open up, we would go and try it out. And then like that meal would become that day's autobiographical comic. And so like the more I worked on it, the more I realized how much I enjoyed working with food as a subject, and all of the issues that go with that, like culinary diasporas and history, and how recipes and ingredients change over time and as they travel from one nation to the next. And just that kind of cultural exchange, was just so fascinating to me. And like I would draw new recipes that I was learning in this comic, and like, or new ingredients that I was learning about. And it just that grew organically enough, and when I realized that like this comic was accidentally focusing on my love for food, I just started to think like, maybe there's something more here, and that I could do this more professionally. And it was around that time that a couple of the restaurants that I had drawn comics about had actually reached out and contacted me to see if I wanted to like draw posters or emails for them. And Fat Rice was one of them.
That's super cool. I mean, there is something about like whether it's dining out or cooking at home or whatever, that it kind of is almost like, it feels like everybody always talks about like eating seasonally and being so like aware of that, or how we're not aware of it anymore and we should be. But I do think that what you're describing is almost like, in some ways, like the actual modern attainable version of that, where you're just describing like making these autobiographical comics, thinking about like what makes up your, hour or day or year, in a way that like I haven't done in a long time, but used to have a I almost like, I like hesitate to even say the word now, because now it's like Substack and newsletter, but everybody's really just trying to say blog. They're just avoiding saying the word blog. But that was a really kind of like meditative, neat process back when I used to do that more regularly, where it's sort of just like you're looking at the things that kind of like make up your life, and the restaurants that we go to, and the things that we eat, and kind of the things that are in season, or as we were talking about, the things that we get in our CSA. Right. I think like when you are forcing yourself to kind of like step back and write and draw about them, I would imagine there's a certain element of like, oh, I'm getting to like look at them in a different way and gain an appreciation for them and how they kind of like converse with my life at the moment.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it was something that I didn't realize was that important of a thread through my life until I started doing these daily web comics, and it started popping up regularly that like, what was the most noteworthy thing that happened to me today? What am I going to write about? What am I going to draw about? And it 9 times out of 10 it was like, oh, I learned how to cook this thing in a new way, or we went to this amazing new restaurant that taught me things about like, Japanese izakaya culture that I had never thought about before.
Yeah, I mean, that's super cool. I kind of remember having that, and it was even, I had been cooking for a few years and then having the realization of like, oh no, I really like this, and I really just like food, and I think I like it in like an active way, whatever that means. I think I think it makes up a bigger part of my life than I do or than I thought it did. And realizing that can mean a lot of different things. That doesn't, I think I had a kind of like a little bit of a, like, I don't know, I have, I'll hear sometimes, people say like, oh, so-and-so's like obsessed with food. And I think sometimes, especially for like an older generation, that comes with a lot of baggage. Like there's a lot of this idea of that as kind of like indulgent or gross or weird or gluttonous, or it can kind of almost serve as a watchword for like, oh, that person's like unhealthy, or there can be a lot of like judgy kind of, that can be freighted with a lot of kind of like some judgier meanings. But when I finally realized like, oh, I think I am obsessed with it. And I don't just mean that in a way of somebody who's like, I'm a foodie, like whatever that means, even though I guess it's kind of like I'm avoiding saying that in the same way that I'm avoiding saying like I had a blog, that it can, I remember realizing that and realizing, oh, this is a really, really fun thing to spend my time and attention on. And it's very rewarding. And now that I've realized that I like actively like it, I can pursue it in the same way that I used to and still do pursue like liking music or movies or TV. That it's
exactly, it's a legitimate interest, and like there are lots of amazing, deep, life-changing human stories that you can tell using food as a medium.
so speaking of like stories and journeys, can and how, I guess what I'm really asking here is like, how did ramen come to be? Because like one of the things I was so interested in finding out, and it felt like of a piece with when I found out going from sort of like high school to college, like, oh, ramen doesn't mean literally instant ramen the way sometimes still when I mention like, I love ramen, I still see like in some people's eyes, like, oh, you still think I mean like literal instant ramen. Not that instant ramen isn't
Right.
great. And one of the great things in the past few years has been discovering like the world of amazing instant ramen that is out there. But like ramen as a genre and as a thing, and as we're talking about it in this sense, like how did it come to be? Because I was shocked to learn how kind of recent a lot of its development was.
Yeah, it's funny. You kind of just assume any kind of food from Japan is just super ancient and thousands of years old. Um, and it's just like with ramen, it's not, and it's such a recent thing, and obviously imported um, from China, really like 100 years ago or so. It's the kind of thing that was just a very nutritious, and when I say nutritious, I mean like calorie count nutritious during wartime, where like that was pretty precious to get, and to use a lot of, like the stuff was coming from the States, like, like wheat noodles and pork and whatnot, and to make these like high calorie meals that were cheap, easy to sell out of a cart if you did it right. And it was just kind of like sustenance, and probably in in that vein, not that wildly different from like the 10 for $1 ramen that we get in the store. But then like once you start coming out of that, you get guys that wanted to make, that saw such potential in it, like, whether it's regional ingredients, seasonal ingredients, or whatever else, and saw opportunity to really kind of let the freak flag fly, and do whatever they wanted to, because like in so many other corners of Japanese cuisine, there just isn't a lot of room for that kind of expression. You do it very traditionally in the way that it's always been done, and with ramen you can just get weird, and that's where we're at right now, and kind of have been with it, um, maybe for the last 30 or 40 years, but really like in the States, it's more in the last couple decades that, and really more in the past 5 to 10 years, that it's gotten so popular here. Um, I see the same look in people's eyes when you bring up ramen. Like, yeah, there's still people that don't get like how complex and beautiful it can be. Um, but that's what the book's for, to kind of to bring them into that world and to make it, and then for people such as yourself who who loved it, but it's kind of hard to wrap your head around it because it seems like such a simple and quick thing, and we wanted to show people that maybe it's not simple and quick, maybe it is complex, but that is something that you can do at home, um, from start to finish the whole way. So ramen is just like the way it's sort of taken over. It's interesting right now, unfortunately, of course, as everything with the pandemic. um, it's tough to make ramen to go,
Yeah.
and it's a very slurpy, splattery thing, and you're not exactly sitting across from people eating it. However, like in Japan, typically this is not a social meal. You sit down, you're usually facing a wall or maybe the bar, the counter where the guy's doing the ramen, um, and you slurp it down and you're in and out, or you're in a train station and you're doing the same thing, and it's such a fast meal, and so by that virtue, it's been difficult to it's hard to run a restaurant of that model in the States because everyone wants to linger and dine and get another drink and all that kind of stuff, and it's so hard to do that here. um, so I don't know, there's a lot of potential, but like right now, boy, I'm always thinking about that, like how do you set up these stalls or whatever where people just come
Right.
and eat ramen. I don't know.
Yeah, I have to say I was so incredibly like weirdly vindicated by the passage in your book that's talking about sort of, just the traditional experience of eating ramen in as it's eaten in Japan just being a sort of like, you are not there for more than 10 minutes, you get in, you get the thing, you're eating it, you're gone. That was so, I felt so like seen by that, like to use a
That's
modern
great.
cliche, because I eat really fast. It's a problem. And when I read that, then it really kind of like put a bee in my bonnet to be like, well, when I'm having ramen, and this also too, I think a big part of it was like, because sometimes it can be like a travel thing for me where I'll be like working and I'll just sort of make a point to like try to seek out, a lot of different stuff that there is to eat in whatever place I may happen to be, but definitely kind of going like, what's the ramen situation right now?
Yeah.
Um, for me, it can be a very solitary thing. And I sort of felt freed by that. Like it felt really nice to go like, oh, I don't even have to be like kid myself that I'm going to like, I'm dining alone. So I'm going to like bring a book and like read a page and a half and probably get,
Right.
splashes of broth on it. I can just like go and eat it and leave and almost feel like I did a good job. I did it the right. I did it the right way, as opposed to being like, oh my god.
Plus in ramen.
What's
Absolutely.
that?
You get an A+ in ramen.
Yes, yes, exactly.
It's such a it's a great topic to research, and so when I went to Japan a few years ago last to do so, it's awesome because you can just like cruise around and eat as much ramen as you can, and you're only most of the time spent is waiting for a seat to open up, um, versus actually eating. So there are days I'd eat like 6 bowls of ramen, and you can just like boom, boom, boom. Versus like I'm going to a restaurant, I'm making a reservation. Is the guy gonna look at me funny because it's just me? That sort of thing. You're just like cruising around Japan eating ramen.
Oh, and there's something that's so appealing about that from somebody that has like, food FOMO sometimes of like, oh, I'm in a place and I want to try all the stuff and this place is supposed to be good and that place is supposed to be good. The idea that you don't have to limit yourself to those 3 meals a day, that you could just be like, I am only limited by my stomach capacity and my tenuous grasp on my self-respect,
That's all,
like
like, sense
that's
of
it.
decency. Other than
Yes.
that, yeah. I hear you. We're cut from the same cloth, DC. I feel the same way most of the time.
It really, I remember I think it was probably the trip that my friend who I was working with was like, you've been on this ramen kick for a while. I don't know if you realize that. I had gone to, and I think I found out about it from Let's Make Ramen. I was in New York, and this is obviously when like restaurants were still fully open and stuff and pre-pandemic. But Ramen Lab, which is down, I think
Oh
it's in
yeah,
like Soho or around there, which
yeah.
is
Lower side.
literally um, I guess does Sun Noodles run Ramen Lab, or are they like a partner in it, or
They do.
what's the
So they,
connection?
I think, so it's like an incubator and they finance it, and they like in normal times, it's basically becomes a pop up for whatever ramen star chef from wherever comes in and runs it. So how cool to live in New York and that's like always different, you know?
Yeah, it was really I was sort of like, okay, I really want to go there, like whatever's happening there, if I can go, I will. So one night after work, and it was, I think it was like really hot in New York too because it was August, and I said to the other writers like, well, okay, if anybody wants to come, they can, but I'm going down to have ramen in Soho on like a Wednesday night at like 9. And
Yeah.
everybody was like, no, it's hot and gross. We don't want to do that. What's wrong with you? And I just took the train down, and it was great. There was nobody on the street. There was barely anybody there. And I wish I could remember the name of the chef or the place, but it was a place in New Jersey that was about to open up. I'll look it up and
Awesome.
probably drop it in afterward. But and they were doing like, it was a seafood ramen, and I don't have a ton of experience with like sort of like more seafood broth based ramen that had like, I think it might have had like a crayfish in it or something. It was so great. Like some sort of like head on crustacean was in there. And I had just been sort of like charged up with the whole like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to, if I eat ramen really fast, it not only is it okay, but I'm doing it the right way. So I remember just going in, ordering. I don't feel weird about being like the only person there. And these two women who looked very sort of like Soho influencery, like women in their early to mid 20s, came in after me and ordered the same thing. And the fact that I had like, I think they got theirs first for whatever reason, and I started after them and finished long before them. And I
Oh
could
yeah.
definitely feel an air of like, that guy is like, he's like, he might be some sort of weird ramen eating Travis Bickle figure. We're not sure. He ate that entirely too fast. We are worried about his mental health.
Right. This guy's
I felt,
legit.
yes, but I felt very much like, yeah, but the guys behind the counter get it. They know. They
Right.
they they understand. I felt so sort of uh yeah, I felt very much like, no, you don't understand. You're the weird ones because you're talking.
Totally. That's, it's so like I always tell the story of my sister lives in Kofu, Yamanashi, and like right at the foothills of Mount Fuji in Japan. And we'll go to like the place, her husband's favorite ramen place, and we're always in there. And there's always a line, and man, you just feel these eyes in the back of your head of people waiting, and they're just like, hurry, hurry up, man. I'm like waiting my turn, and you just feel that pressure. And so it all the more encouragement to crush the bowl.
Yeah, there's something great about it. There's something kind of consumerist in a way, like that feels like, I don't know, that definitely tickles a very American, I feel like, itch for me, which is just sort of like, I want to get that thing and I want to have it, and then it's going to be gone, and I'm going to be like, oh man, that was great. I wish I still had it, but it's gone now. But I'm moving on. I was a good consumer, and I'm
It's a good
I'm
part.
exactly. I'm keeping it moving. It's sort of interesting though. I was just thinking about it when you were talking about the sort of the origins of ramen and how it's come to more prominence in America in the past like 20 or so years. You almost would have thought, now that I'm thinking about it, like it's really interesting to me that sushi was earlier in the sort of like American cultural adoption
Sure.
than ramen. Because you think about ramen, it's like you would have thought that would be so much more familiar to the American palate and easy to take on board because it's like it's
Salty and
noodles and
fatty.
like broth and meat usually.
Yeah, I feel like sushi when that kind of came up, it was such a that was it was just it was more of the style, like it was in vogue, it was like quote unquote light, and before everyone started hating carbs, and it was just like it was just like clean, and it's what you did if you were elegant and you lived in in like pointy shouldered sport coats and things like that versus like ramen, you're kind of just a slob who's cheap if you eat ramen. You know, unfortunately, that's my explanation. That could be way off. I don't know.
That makes total sense. Although it seems like a common theme between the two of them. Like I have not eaten and explored nearly as much sushi or sought out as much good sushi. Although I do love it and have places where my wife and I will be like, let's go to that strip mall sushi place that we secretly know is like $150 every time we go there, but it's so good and we have to do it, like once a year. It seems like something that they both have in common is that like even in the sort of highest echelon of sushi place or ramen place, the dining experience is probably going to be like 10 minutes. Like, do you know what I mean? Like that you're actually, that's just very interesting to me. What do you think, accounts for that? Like, where does that emerge from culturally? Why is that the expectation?
I don't know. I mean, it's not like it. If you're drinking in Japan, usually socially, you're sort of in an izakaya or you're just like out with other dudes and ties and like just like drinking beer and eating salty like karage and fried chicken and all that kind of stuff. Um, and I feel like space is at such a premium, so it's just kind of like in and out, and time seems to be at a premium too. Like you're not there doesn't seem to be as much leisure time, like as as we have on this side of the Pacific.
Yeah, actually, while we were talking about this, I was thinking the best sushi I ever had was on a trip to Japan, and my partner's brother lives there. I've got a cousin who lives in Mitaka as well, but my partner's brother, we were visiting him in Tokyo, and he took us to this, I forget the name for it in Japanese, but it was called a standing sushi place. And the dining experience was very much like the ramen experience, where everyone besides us in the shop was a businessman who was eating alone. And they had like just gotten off of the train. They were on their way home. They stopped in, they were sort of standing face forward, eating the sushi, and then like going on their way to their next appointment or whatever. And so it was a very efficient, streamlined experience, even though like the guys were making the sushi right there in front of us. And it was phenomenal. It was the best sushi I'd ever eaten, even without a chair to sit down on and like savor everything. But yeah,
so functional.
Something about like the efficiency of the time, and just like what can you fit into your workday.
There is something so weirdly kind of like romantic about that. I literally am like, what Wong Kar-wai movie am I thinking of? Is it just literally In the Mood for Love? You know what I mean? Just the feeling of sort of like, and I know that's Chinese, but like there's just something about the like lone kind of like businessman guy who's just like, I am just like a cog in the machine, but I'm just going to go and eat this thing, probably standing up. And it's just for me. I'm not talking to anybody. I'm not seeing anybody. I probably will never tell anybody about this, but like, this is like this little slot in my day for like, I enjoy this. Right. And that's, I don't know. There's something kind of just very like, feels like an old short story from like the 60s. It feels kind of weirdly Don Drapery, except it's like, I'm not cheating on my wife. I'm just standing and having sushi for 10 minutes. I there's something neat about that.
That show Midnight Diner, I think it's called. And they're, it's just like a guy who opens his shop at midnight in Tokyo or wherever. And it's always just like dudes come in after work because they're working all hours. And when you say Don Draper, to me, that's spot on because it's such a solo thing. And I feel like, families aren't going out to TGI Fuddruckers in Japan, they're like eating at home or they're separate meals or whatever it is in the more traditional.
Yeah, I don't know. There's something that's really neat about that to me. I don't know why. I can't fully explain it. I guess maybe it's also, again, feeling weirdly, knowing that there is a culture out there that is does resonate a little more or doesn't place a weird stigma on you're like eating alone or going to, like that there's that's been something that I've always really valued and liked and felt a little weird about. And so just knowing that there's a place where it's like, it's okay, man. We literally like everyone in our entire economy does it and it's totally fine and it's good. I appreciate that. Thank you, Japan. So when you were talking about the sort of like evolutions in ramen or places that it's going, ways that it's evolving, this sort of like open canvas that it is, what are some of the most exciting like ramen makers or developments or movements that you see emerging? Where are the two of you seeing ramen going that excites you?
I mean, I see it all over the States because, I mean, it's definitely happening in Japan, but like it gets so elevated there, like they're Michelin star ramen restaurants. And I think it's interesting to see you guys doing different, like noodles aren't just noodles anymore, like you have your own noodle, you have your way of doing it. It has to be just so. And that's such an important thing, obviously. Um, the different broths that people are doing, like I don't really care so much about like, oh, I'm putting this weird topping in it. To me, it's like the broth and the noodles. And I'm also, I should admit, like I don't really have finger on the pulse regarding all this kind of stuff. But these guys, like, so Ivan Orkin, when I was talking to him regarding the book and his little sort of feature in it, he kept referring to these guys as ramen nerds, and he did it like affectionately. And these are the guys, and like Mike Satinover, who's in the book as well. He's here in Chicago. I mean, this guy, he's just a walking encyclopedia of all things ramen, and he knows styles, and he's experienced styles, and he's been all over Japan, et cetera, et cetera. And those are the guys to kind of listen to if you're really interested in all these different styles, because they can like talk forever about that. Me, I'm just like, man, I like a dirty old tonkotsu as much, but I really like, I had this great duck ramen in Tokyo, so clean, just like clear, clean, pristine, beautiful, tempura, leek, garnishes, all that kind of stuff. So that's kind of my non-answer to your question.
Oh man. Yeah. I was introduced, that was another thing that I was introduced to from your book was Mike Satinover, AKA Ramen Lord, the dorkiest name in the history of the internet of anything, and started following him on Instagram. And then before long I was like, I don't want Instagram. I just want his Instagram stories. Like that's it.
Yeah.
And it's just like a guy in his apartment who I think he's like, seems like he's started doing pop-ups and definitely it was one of these things during the pandemic where I was like, I kind of wish I was in Chicago for this, because these pop-ups seem great of like carry out like ramen stuff. But it's just a guy in his apartment, just like making bowl after bowl of ramen and trying to get this right and trying to get that right. And the amount of like, I think it made me realize like, oh, I am in no way this kind of person. Like there's a sort of like, I think that I'm going to get it wrong, but there's like some metaphorical thing about like, are you a fox or are you a hedgehog or something, where it's like, or I think it's like foxes are kind of, they are going around and they basically, I think it's like foxes know a bunch of stuff a little bit and hedgehogs know one thing very strongly. Yeah. And I might even be I'm pretty sure it's hedgehog. I might be wrong about the fox. That's how little I know about even this thing. And I realized like, oh, I am in no way a hedgehog. And Mike Satinover is a hedgehog because he is so incredibly deep on this thing. And it speaks to that it speaks to that ramen is like an incredibly deep like subject that somebody could get this deep into. And then it also just speaks to the sort of like a beautiful thing about the human brain and about curiosity, where I kind of think like, oh, I bet you if something had just caught him slightly different in his brain chemistry, he would just be completely into something else. It doesn't have to be ramen. It's just like how deep we can go into something and into following our own curiosity where it leads, I think is really, really cool. I don't know. I just think that there's like something about that. And so I would highly recommend that anybody, if you like ramen, just follow this guy and follow his like 90 pain Instagram stories about like noodle hydration and stuff. It's
Absolutely.
so cool
Yeah.
and soothing and great.
So thorough. So thorough with everything.
Definitely.
Why do you two think that Chicago is, it seems like a really great ramen town? Why is that, do you think?
Ooh, that's a great question because like there's not a strong Japanese presence here the way there's like so many other cultures represented here. Um, and so I don't know. I mean, first of all, Chicago is such a great food city.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's like the canvas for it. And now ramen has gained in popularity, and there are chains that are really good that want to open in Fulton Market because that's where all the restaurants are these days. But then you have guys like Mike and whoever else who are doing their thing. So I don't know. I mean, Sarah, I don't know if you have insight on that, but that's
I think that you hit it on the head, though. I think it's just that Chicago is an incredible food city, and it's full of people who are. I mean, I feel like adventurous is kind of a pedantic word to use here, but like an audience that's very receptive to different stuff and new stuff and interesting stuff, as long as it's in like a cool, non-pretentious setting. I think if you want to open a restaurant in Chicago, I mean, maybe not during a global pandemic. It's a bad time for restaurants right now. But in normal times, like I think that this is a great place to try something new, to try to introduce people to a new dining experience. And Chicagoans are going to come out for that, and they're going to spend money on it. And they're going to talk about how great it is and tell all their friends to eat there. So it might not necessarily be a ramen thing, but I think it's definitely a food thing. Because you're right. I mean, there's definitely a history of like a Japanese immigrant community here. But at this point, I think most of that has moved out to the suburbs.
Yeah, for sure. And that makes me think another thing too, that there's it's probably a little like easier to open. If you don't have everyone on your back being like, this isn't right, this isn't traditional, this isn't how my mom made it, you can just like do it.
Right.
You open a pierogi shop or like a hot dog stand or you fish for here, you're screwed.
Yeah, it seems it I also, I guess, like my sort of like, as you guys are talking about it and I was thinking about it, I'm like, I think my little glib, also like freakonomicsy oversimplification of it is it's cold.
Yeah. Except when it's hot.
Yeah.
That's true. That's a really good point. And it also completely, because I think of, I'm biased, but I think of LA as being such a great ramen city, and is definitely where I fully like fell in love with ramen. And it's not cold in LA, although where I think like where the more traditionally sort of like big ramen spots in LA are closer to the water, where it is breezier. So that's cool. I'm going to try to wedge my theory in still.
I like it.
Thank you. So Sarah, you also have like a connection to this podcast because you actually did the art for it, which is literally, I was like on the fence about like, am I even going to do this show? And I'm going to do the show. And then I had contacted you about commissioning some art, and you came back with even just like the first draft. And it was so much better than I ever could have imagined, that I was like, now I have to do the fucking show. I have to try to make a show that's, 10% as cool as this art for it. And you mentioned at one point, oh, sorry, you were saying?
Oh, just, that's very nice of you to say. Thank you.
But you had mentioned, I remember like before you had officially like colored in the, or officially just like literally colored in the images, you were like, what are you thinking color wise? Cause if you don't have a strong preference, I can do just like delicious colors that make people want to eat on a subconscious level. And I thought that was so cool. And I was just wondering like, what about what about how things appear and what about color makes us want to eat them? How did you start becoming acquainted with that like visual language? How does that influence your art style and the way that you think about it? And then I guess, how does that also extend to literally like actual food and how we interact with it?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is reasonably accepted color theory. I mean, it's, there's nothing super scientific about it, but I do graphic design, and a lot of the clients that I work with are restaurants. So this has come up a lot, where typically the human appetite is stimulated by colors in like the red and orange and yellow spectrum, and the appetite is a little bit diminished by cooler colors and like purples and blues. And I've read a couple of studies where, college students made something like scrambled eggs and used food coloring and had people taste test them. And even though they were exactly the same dish, people said that the blue scrambled eggs didn't taste as good as like the yellow and the orange scrambled eggs. There's just, I think a lot of it has to do with
some virulently anti Dr. Seuss scholarship going on there.
But I think a lot of it has to do with the things that we associate with these colors too. That it's not necessarily something innate, but more something like cultural and historical. So in the United States, like this is just an example, in the United States, most banks and financial firms have blue tones in their logos. But if you go to Asia, most banks and financial firms use red for their logos because red is more associated with like success and prosperity. And here there's something about blue that I think people associate with like responsibility and financial security and safety. And maybe that's why that happens. So it's not like one of those colors means like to the universal human experience that like this is money and security. It's the things that like historically and culturally we associate with those things. So at least in our culture in the West, historically and culturally, like reds and yellows, they evoke restaurants, they evoke meals. Like a lot of the ingredients that you're going to be picking up from your farmers markets are going to be reds and oranges and yellows and greens, right? And not very many of those things are going to be bright blue or bright purple. So I think that's a lot of it. And a lot of marketers and advertisers have sort of picked up on that. So if you go, like if you're driving on the highway and, you stop at an exit for some fast food, the vast majority of those fast food restaurants are going to have reds and yellows in their logo.
Yes.
And
wow.
Very occasionally you'll find one that has blue. So like here in the Midwest, we have Culver's and they use blue in their logo, but that blue is associated with the dairy industry. So much of what Culver's does is like these, heavy cheeseburgers and then like milkshakes. So they'll use the blue to sort of evoke that part of it. But, your Burger Kings and your Wendy's and your McDonald's, like all of them are going to have reds and yellows in their logos.
What if you could? The cartoon version of me has like all these logos swirling over my head right now. And I'm like, oh my God, she's right. This almost feels like the color theory version of Fight Club where you're breaking it down for me. Like, here's why corporate America is the way it is. And I'm like, oh my God, yeah, this is crazy, but it works. It totally does. I was thinking about like bank logos and I'm thinking about like Chase and Charles Schwab and different things. And I'm going like, oh my God, yeah, it's blue. And even before you said it, I was like, oh yeah. Cause it's like, I just immediately think like cool, rational, just sort of like, okay, we're proceeding with your money in a very blue sort of way. And that's why I have all of my holdings at Blue Man Group, limited partners.
I've always thought it was kind of interesting that you don't even see like that many bank logos that are green, like, all American money is green, but yeah, no, it's very much blue across the board. It's really interesting.
That's so interesting. Huh.
Yeah.
Oh, please, you're saying.
With when I'm illustrating food, like either for these cookbooks or, for a client that I'm drawing food for, a lot of times those colors are in the food anyway, but I will either like exaggerate them or even substitute them for a color that doesn't necessarily match what's on the plate in front of you, but a color that evokes what the flavor is going to be. So, I mean, I feel like this sounds like, this sounds a little pretentious, but in a lot of times I try to draw what the food tastes like rather than what the food looks like. So especially in the ramen book, especially when like we were doing the ajitsuke tamago, like the soft boiled eggs, like every time I did those, I wanted that yolk in that egg to just like fluoresce and be as like goopy and saturated as possible to sort of evoke what it feels like to bite into one of those and have it like gush in your mouth.
Oh yeah, and you have this great, just like it makes it, it's one of those things, and this is why I get mad when people are like, a recipe shouldn't have head notes, because now I'm like, I'll always think about this image now when I think about that kind of egg, which is it's essentially it's like a poached egg, right?
Yeah.
Effectively.
Yeah, soft boiled. Yeah.
Right. So you have this amazing, like, as I remember it, I don't have the book in front of me, but in my head, it's this like 2-page spread of these snow monkeys, like lowering baskets of eggs into, am I off base on this? I feel like there's...
Well, I was sort of combining a couple of things because Hugh and I were talking about, when we got into that, about how there's this tradition where, you know, you would, if you lived in Japan, you would take your eggs down to the hot spring and you'd like put them in the hot spring while you soaked. And then like they have special baskets for this specifically to take your eggs down to the hot spring. And then when you were done with your soak in the hot spring, you'd have these soft boiled eggs to take home. And I was sort of combining that with my memory of like the National Geographic, like Japanese macaques soaking in the hot springs in the mountain. Like, well, maybe they're soft boiling their own eggs.
But that's what's so great, and something that I feel like you could never express in, or you could express in words alone, but it would just be kind of like clunkier if you tried to write that down at the beginning of a recipe. Whereas in this format, it's just so that will always, now that any kind of soft boiled egg, and Haley, my wife, loves soft boiled eggs. She used to eat one for lunch every day. She's like perfected her technique. She makes like the best ones. I'll probably ask her to make one for lunch after this. Now that will always be a little bit like, have the sort of like snow monkey hot springs kind of like, it's just the perfect, for some reason, the perfect non-literal evocative image. And that's great. That's so cool and neat. And is that thing where it's like comic books are the poor person's version of movies, because it's like you could take me there, and normally if it were a literal image, you would have to be like, okay, where are we going to get some fucking snow monkeys? But you just draw it and it's there and it's great.
Train the eggs in the water. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So speaking of the books and comic book cookbooks, I am desperate to talk about, and just for myself to find out more about you two's next project, because if there is a type of food that I have been enthusiastic about for longer than I've been enthusiastic for ramen, and even more enthusiastic about than I have been for ramen, it is dumplings. True or false, you two are, your next book, the follow-up to Let's Make Ramen is Let's Make Dumplings.
Dumplings, yes.
Oh,
very true.
It comes out in June 2021.
So what has that process been like? What was the research phase like? How did you decide how to organize the book and what to put in it? How is it going? Do you hate dumplings now? Tell me everything.
Never. It was really like, I was like, let's do every dumpling in the world. And anything, and it was this big sort of vision quest of what is a dumpling, do things like, is it anything that's encased, so it's like a tamale, a dumpling, et cetera, et cetera. But we ended up focusing on Asian dumplings, and, we wanted to keep the book about the same size as ramen, both in page count and recipe count. And so we really focused on Asian dumplings. And as far as the research phase, it was delicious and wonderful. And we have in here, like we included recipes for homemade wrappers for dumplings, homemade wrappers for wontons, and then there's, I don't know, like 30 other recipes for various dumplings, traditional dumplings like gyoza, xiaolongbao. We also have like bao, like regular bao and fillings for that. We have some sweet dumplings. We have some riffs that I just made, and it's super fun. It's super great, and it's like it was fun the second time around. Certain things were easier, just because we are like more used to each other now, and speak the same language. And yeah, man, it was fun. We're pumped and we're done with it. So that's where it's at. We don't have to do it anymore. It's already getting printed.
Okay, off the top of your head, and I am asking you this because I genuinely want to know, because then when tourism is a thing again, I want to go there and have it. But I'm also asking because I just want to say what my own is, because I want people to support them at all costs, because they absolutely must stay open through this time. It just has to be. What is your favorite dumpling? Let's say favorite dumpling in America.
Ooh.
Mine easy. Dumpling Galaxy in Flushing, Queens. It's in the basement of a grocery store, and if you're in New York, you take a train for like an hour to get out to Flushing, and and then you walk through this neighborhood and go into the store and wonder where you're at, and go down to this basement, and this lady, she has a book too. Her name is Helen Yu, and she just rocks these dumplings, and they're delicious, and they do like made to order dumplings too, like you pick your filling kind of thing, which is insane. That's my vote.
Amazing.
What is your favorite, or just off the top of your head, a favorite dumpling that you've had at Dumpling Galaxy?
Well, I go like straight pork and chive. I mean, just the traditional one, but they do like, I want to say like 25 fillings available. I think lamb, obviously, pork, chicken. There's probably some seafood in there, but I just love a pork and chive dumpling, just basic.
For me, it's
sorry, real quick, Sarah. I was just going to say, the night that I did end up going to Ramen Lab was the fallback restaurant that I went to instead of taking the train out to Flushing and going to Dumpling Galaxy.
Is that right?
Absolutely. Yes. 100%. I was like, I've heard there's this place, and like Flushing is like the dumpling spot. And in part, I was just mad at myself for having lived in New York for 6 years and never gone out to Flushing once to eat. I didn't even know it was a thing until I didn't live there anymore. And I was so just mad at myself. So I was like, okay, I have to get redemption. I have to go to Dumpling Galaxy. And every night it would be like, okay, if we get out by 7, I'm going to go to Dumpling Galaxy. And then I didn't do it. I almost literally did it on the way to the airport, but I didn't. I had a hangover instead is what I opted to do. But yes, I can't. Dumpling Galaxy, please hold on. I must go. That is such a strong endorsement. And Sarah, your favorite dumpling in America?
So off the top of my head, it would be here in Chicago, Chu Kwan Bakery. They do a char siu bao that is like the platonic ideal of char siu bao. I will measure other char siu baos against. Like it's big. It fits perfectly in the palm of your hand. It's like gleaming white, and it's just puffy and soft and filled with barbecue pork, and it makes me so happy.
So that was after we made the tonkatsu, and Haley made the noodles from your book and everything like that. And we made we made what is it called? Chashu, that is still that we still have some in the freezer that I'm super excited about. Will provide us the perfect excuse to make more ramen. Haley was like, we have to make char siu bao. And I can't wait. And I know I'm in good hands because she's actually good at like baking stuff, or she's good at like things with doughs that I'm not good at and have no experience with. And I'm so excited. I can't wait. And that sounds tremendous. When you described the gleaming whiteness of it, I feel like I could, because again, it's that contrast, right? Like the color contrast of the white of the bun and then the red inside. Oh, yeah. It's so good. So I will say, I wanted to say my favorite in the world that I've ever had. I think it might be my favorite food available at a restaurant is at Kang Kang Food Court in the San Gabriel Valley. It's Alhambra, and it is the best. It's extremely discovered. Like it's on so many like travel shows, and like I think David Chang went to it on like Ugly Delicious, and but it is there. I think it's called different stuff on the menu. It'll just say, I think it says like Shanghai pan fried dumplings when you go there, but it's the Shangjin Bao, and it's so it's the most warming, savory filling of anything I've ever had. Like the broth that's inside of this dumpling is like, so do you guys, have you had it? Do you know what I know
like, it's not that place, but yeah. And we actually have a recipe for that in the book too.
Yes. Yes. Oh my God. It can't come soon enough. It's so exciting.
And make it myself. Like, there were a few of them where I was like, I like all of these words. I'm going to go make them before I finish drawing this one.
And what was your experience making them? Was it worth the time and effort? Because I'm a little bit like, I want to make them, but I feel like I've been to the mountaintop. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's worth the time and effort. I mean, I'm not going to say it's not effort. It's, and of course you have to like form every dumpling after you make the filling and everything. But there's something meditative about that entire process. And then when you're done, you've got these, just incredible, like small, delicious breakfast bao to eat.
Ooh, that makes sense that so are they traditionally a breakfast food?
I think they're sold like so many things. You can get them then, and a lot of people do eat them there, but we tend to go more savory and whatnot here. So we eat it later in the day, but man, I would eat that any time of the day.
Sure.
That makes a lot of sense to me though, because I think when I think of them, I often describe it to people as like Thanksgiving for some reason, where there's just kind of this like really savory, but a little bit of sweetness to the filling that's just like incredibly warming. Like it's just the taste of like comfort and being welcome and like hospitality in a way that feels, when you say it can be eaten as a breakfast food, I'm like, oh, that makes so much sense, because it does have that kind of like, this is a nice start to the day feeling.
Yeah.
I have a friend who lives in Shanghai right now, and she says that it's sort of a ubiquitous breakfast food kind of item.
Well, pack your bags, kids. We're moving to Shanghai. That's awesome. I truly can't wait. Well, my thank you guys so much for doing this. My final question to each of you individually is as follows: if there was one item, one food item, either that you had, growing up, or something that you've had in a restaurant or in your travels that you don't already know how to make, that you could snap your fingers and know how to make perfectly, what would it be?
Oh my God. Okay. This would be so labor intensive, but for me, it's bibimbap.
You've never made it before?
I've had it before. I've never made it before. Like, it just seems like ramen wise that it would be, again, like kind of modular, where you've got a lot of different moving parts that you have to put all together. But like, yeah, I would love to learn how to put all those parts together and make bibimbap. Yeah,
that makes sense. And also feels like, wouldn't you want to have like the real kind of like just a real kind of stone sort of, like a real, like, I don't even know what the vessel is called, but like to get the real crispy whateverness to it.
Yeah.
Oh, that would be great. That's such a good idea. I'm immediately like, how do I do that? Book 3, complete the trilogy. Let's make bibimbap. We're doing it.
Hugh knows how to make everything already.
Well, I know. So I'm sitting here thinking, and really for me, it's sort of like one of these, I know how to make this, but I can't make it in the same way that my mother always made it. And it's sukiyaki. And that, like, so I grew up in Gunnison, Colorado, a really small town. It's Colorado, and it's like the college is there, and then the ranchers are there, and there's not much else. And we had this old door that she would lay on cinder blocks and put the pot in the middle on an electric burner and invite people from the neighborhood, and there'd probably be a dozen of us around the table. And sukiyaki is just basically hot pot of all this different stuff. And she always had this great piece of beef tallow. Who knows where this came from, but she'd get the pot ready with that, and then it's just really thin beef. She'd always argue with the guy at the grocery store because he wouldn't slice it thin enough and all of that, onions and vegetables, all this kind of stuff. And it was just such a good communal around a table, hot rice when I was old enough, meaning like 13 or 14, beer and sake, and like all of that kind of stuff was just so good. And you just can't recreate that. Like I need, it's the kind of thing that like my mom just had the touch for. So that's my answer.
That sounds lovely.
That's awesome. That's a nice place to leave it. It's winter. Just imagining a bunch of people around a table, getting to gather and share something like that is so, that feels like exactly, we've spent this entire time talking about like a meal that can be and is kind of meant to be sort of completely demolished in 9 minutes by a single person staring straight ahead in a booth. So it's nice to leave it with a sort of the food that's like literally meant to be shared and warm and great. Well, thanks for doing this, you guys. It was so much fun, and thank you again for providing the inspiration to kind of like get deeper into this thing that I really like and enjoy, and I'm very much looking forward to doing the same thing with dumplings. And thanks again.
Thank you.
All right, that is it. That is all for this week's episode of Stay for Dinner. Thank you so much to my guests, Sarah Becan and Hugh Amano. Their book, Let's Make Ramen, is available wherever fine books are sold. Please support your local bookseller this holiday season. They really need your help to make it through. They probably deliver online if that is going to make it easier for you to support them. So, look them up. Google independent bookstore by me. Check them out. And speaking of which, my books, The Boy Who Couldn't Sleep and Never Had To and Crap Kingdom, are both novels, and they both make great gifts for people that like genre stuff like fantasy or science fiction, but also kind of more grounded, coming of age or comedic takes on those things. Check them out. I think you'll like them. And again, support your local bookseller. They're also available on Audible or wherever else you find audiobooks if you like listening to me talk. And also, if you enjoyed listening to me talk today, please rate and subscribe the podcast wherever you do that to podcasts. Thank you to Jason Anderson, who my intro music is his song July 4th, 2004. He has a bunch of new music. You can find him at Jason the Band on Twitter, and then he's all over all of the streaming sites and everything like that. Check out his catalog. Check out Advanced Bass, the amazing Owen Ashworth, who did my interstitial music, all of his incredible albums. Speaking of, if we're talking about holiday season stuff, he has a record label called Orindel Records, and they have so many fantastic artists in their catalog. They make beautiful products. Please support them if that sounds good. I also think they're out of Chicago, so that's another Chicago connection. And what else? Again, thanks to Sarah, who I always thank at the end of the show, for doing my my podcast art, and also for being the guest today. And I think that's it. Is that all the plugs I normally do at the end of the show? I think it is. All right, everybody, have a good one, and will I be talking to you again before Christmas? I think I probably will. And so I'll talk to you then. And if not, I'll talk to you in the new year. I don't know how time works. The episodes will continue. So keep checking them out. I hope you enjoy them, and bye-bye.